So today is our second installment, just to remind us and those who may listen that we had covered, well, the general purpose of your 4 volumes and the introduction of the first volume in our previous conversation. And today we're going to cover chapters 2, 3, and 4.
Mm-hmm. And they deal with science as we generally understand it, meaning mainstream science. We sincerely applaud science and are grateful to science, but we talk about also the limits and limitations of science. Just a very quick anecdote. I often go to the Royal Institution lectures in London, and I once heard someone talking on cosmology and consciousness, science is the best way to understand our world. And I thought, really? How does science help us to understand the fact that now, as we speak, we have a war in Ukraine, we have the conflict in the Middle East, and Taiwan is brewing? How does science help us to understand human nature, not the human body? We are very grateful to science for understanding human body. What about human nature? So that's the limitation of science.
Yes. And we'll talk about one of the main problems. And the word problem here means different things to different people. Like when you have a problem, it's something uncomfortable you want to get rid of. But problems in science, they can be seen as gifts because they will reveal something unseen, hopefully. One main problem in science, which is what chapter 2 is about. Chapter 3 is about the assumptions that may help us solve, dissolve, absolve that problem. And then the following chapter is about limitations. And again, limitation sounds as something you want to weave off. But being aware of one's own limitation and whatever activity you do, in this case science, is not just good, it's essential to be able to expand that science that may at some point help us understand human nature. So I think that's the exercise you proposed in the following chapters. And it doesn't need to be said, but it has to. It's like these pointing to problems, assumptions, and limitations is not being anti-science. It's actually the opposite.
Exactly. I cannot agree with you more, Alex. The knee-jerk reaction when you point out any limit or any limitation or any drawback is you're anti. You're not anti. You're displaying a way of moving forward by addressing those limitations.
Yes. And these limitations and the way you talk about science, in particular neuroscience, and also evolution and developmental biology, but it's more centered around the mind, brain, thought problem, as you coin it in the second chapter. Well, this is going to be the transition point or the stepping stone to then get into the mystery teachings. That's going to be in another. I'm really looking forward to that because when you get there, you realize, well, the consciousness is really unfolding here as the title of your book. But today we won't talk about those mystery teachings, but you start with the point that even Nobel laureates disagree strongly on this one arguably the biggest problem, again, in the good sense that science has today, which is the problem of the relationship between mind and brain.
And the diametrically opposed views from many camps, but the main players, the key players, of course, Francis Crick, who was quite adamant that, as he said, your thoughts, your emotions, your everything is nothing but the activity of neurons and glials and their associated ions and molecules. Last time we spoke, you told me you are aware of the adjectives people use. besides adjectives, it's the little noun, it's the little pronouns, there's the little nothing but, which really gives the game away. But on the other hand, Gerald Edelman, also a Nobel laureate, in his book Bright Life, said to reduce the whole of human activity purely to molecular activity is silly. When we consider not only the molecular activity, but the biological activity, the social activity. So if Francis Crick said that the neurons and the brain are part of the transmitting mechanism in the whole picture, that would be sensible, but nothing but. And this, again, is a legacy from the 19th century of Carl Vogt, the German scientist, a great scientist then. And they seem to be fixated on his motto that as the stomach generates gastric juices and the liver generates bile, and a rather more vulgar version of that as well, referring to the kidneys, but in the same way, the brain secretes thoughts like the stomach secretes gastric juices, which sounds very plausible then.
Yes.
But the brain secretes thought. Just translate that to what Crick says. There's a little difference there.
Here we have the problem of what I call confusing the M's, because one thing is a metaphor, another thing is a model, another thing is a metaphysics. And these metaphors are good for what they're worth, right? The problem is when they get linked together with a scientific view of what things should be. Now, let me mention here, it's interesting because you speak about Crick and Edelman, who were, both of them were Nobel laureates, who perhaps in a way were hoping to get a second Nobel Prize now for the really hard problem of consciousness. And they did some service to the academic field, because being Nobel laureates and being kind of belonging to the mainstream, they decided that it was time in the 90s to address this problem, which was left out, forbidden, taboo, dogma within the orthodoxy. So that's something they contributed. Now, these different houses, the houses of Crick and the houses of Edelman, when I was reading your chapter, I realized, well, they represent the best attempts, yet limited, the best attempts of classical physics, if you want, and complexity physics, because Crick was coming as with the usual naive view of the biologist. Well, nothing but what the molecules are doing and all the cells are doing. So we'll look for neural correlates. A fruitful path, but ill-defined probably. And Edelman was coming from the other kind of physics available, which is complexity science. Well, probably it's some sort of emergent property. And there's a third one, which is coming from quantum, and Penrose is a good example.
Penrose and Haveroff.
But they're systematically left out. So still today, we can study consciousness, but it's either the classical way, a la Crick, or the complexity way, a la Edelman, and sophisticated versions of it. The quantum is left out, and they're all trying. They're all trying to solve a really hard problem.
They are trying, and very sincerely in their own way. And neither one or the other is wrong or right, because I constantly emphasize it depends on the context. You know, if you have a physical brain problem, you're looking into the brain structures. You're not looking into the wider social network and all the rest of it.
Yes.
You know, if your car breaks down, you attend to the mechanism of the car. But if your driver is drunk, looking at the nuts and bolts of the car is not going to help the driver.
And here there's a person who's Christoph Koch, who started. He's so interesting because he started with Crick. and then moved towards more the Edelman house, being kind of a heir of the Crick's house, with Giulio Tononi, who's kind of the successor of Edelman. And they weave together this theory, and we don't know if it's going to be the theory, but at least, in my view, Christoph Koch has been brave enough to change his mind and go from a hardcore reductionist materialist to even a panpsychist today. Yeah. And today we have these consciousness wars who are still angrily reacting against anything that goes away from the materialistic reductionistic dogma. But Christoph Koch is an amazing example of how you can be a very notorious scientist and still just explore and see if you can solve the problem if you now look at from this other metaphysical, not just metaphorical or models.
Metaphysical, because he now subscribes to, as you said, panpsychism, the idea that all of nature has the quality of mind. And I think Christoph Koch, I believe he's talking in one of the major conferences for the Scientific and Medical Network, if I'm not mistaken. But equally, Wilder Penfield, the great Canadian neurosurgeon, he started off with this whole idea that the brain generates consciousness, but through his own research, he unwillingly at first then moved on to write in his wonderful book that, as he said, the problem of neurology is to understand man himself. So although the content of consciousness depends to a large extent, as Penfield said, on neuronal activity, the awareness itself does not. And it seems to me, he says, more reasonable to suggest that there is a mind that may be distinct and quite different in its essence. So Penfield, like Christoph Koch, had the courage of his own convictions, and he explored and he pushed the boundaries. And limitations, in the best sense, are essential, because how can you move forward without having something to push against? It's like friction, you know. Yes. If you're walking on ice, it's difficult. You need resistance. So limitations must be used positively.
And also to highlight the positive arc of these 30 years of consciousness studies in the mainstream. Well, one can see a beautiful shift from the nothing but, that you're nothing but a pack of neurons, this kind of really childish, it was called the astonishing hypothesis, but to me it's a ridiculous hypothesis, right? Yeah. But we go from this to the idea of, and the need to understand man himself, right? The human being, to understand the human being. So a broader scope that consciousness science, and you'll write about this in the third chapter, by the way, I think, when you discuss, it's the third chapter, let me see. No, it's more the fourth chapter. I'm going ahead. But when you speak about the death blows to materialism, one is quantum mechanics 100 years ago, and non-locality with the Nobel Prize a year ago for entanglement. And the other one is consciousness science. So it's a gift again. Consciousness science, with all its frictions and wars and confusions and bullshit, I may say. I think in this confusion, we have another opportunity to go beyond.
Yes. Definitely. Quantum science has shown the power of science at its best. That even Einstein, the great Einstein, was very uncomfortable with the whole idea of non-locality. Again, he had the courage of his convictions, whereby he couldn't disprove the equations, so to speak, but he found it very uncomfortable all the time.
Yes, no wonder, even for a mind like him, because as you summarize, again, I'm just mentioning where it is, because that's also a guide to the reader, right? But at the end of chapter 4, when you speak about quantum mechanics, there are all these concepts, right? Like non-locality, the indivisibility of certain exchanges of energy, right? Something that it's hard to conceive for the intellect. Okay, so it has to be in quanta, right? Yeah. But there's also now the reality of probabilistic thinking in the sense that we don't only have the actual, we have now the virtual, and these are two modes of existing, right? Mm-hmm. Then we have indeterminacy, we have acausal correlations,
yes.
We have duality, one thing can be something and its opposite, so we have complementarity. These are all like heavy ideas for the classical mind, even if you're Albert Einstein.
The classical mind that likes things nicely packaged in a box, a deterministic mind. Mm-hmm. But when one moves from pure determinism to probabilities of existence rather than actual existence, that certainly introduces far more dimensions and components and entities that need to be put into the whole equation. Yes.
And you highlighted these features or these aspects are in good resonance with the mystery teachings, right? And with perennial philosophy.
They are indeed very much so, especially the thoughts of great legendary scientists like Schrödinger, of course, Wolfgang Pauli, most certainly Einstein, even Edelman a little earlier on, and others like Peter Leggett, who is the Vice Chancellor of Surrey University, and many of the great scientists in the scientific and medical network, Roger Penrose. I'm not saying they prove the mystery teachings. I mean, it's almost meaningless to say prove, but they point towards.
Yes.
They allude. They indicate the direction.
Yes. I like that, in the same way that there's a difference. And throughout the book, by the way, and we'll see it in further chapters, you do something that, if I can refer to Ian McGilchrist again, and right. Something I enjoyed, you make all these distinctions, clarifications, and to me they're like, they allow the different joints to now move with more freely, because now when we speak about materialism, we don't need to speak about science and metaphysics altogether. We realize these, or when you will speak in the future, chapters about the difference between, perennial philosophy, theosophy, occult science. There's also, we gain degrees of freedom, if you will. So
freedom is a nice way of putting it, yes, and dimension.
So another degree of freedom you just mentioned, like difference between proof and point. And before, when we were discussing about, for instance, Christoph Koch, I think he's entertaining, not necessarily endorsing panpsychism. So this word is very important. Why can't we entertain other ways of conceiving the problem?
Yes.
Just have them, hold them, and see what they show. It's like, okay, now we look through this other telescope now that we're in Galileo's month, right? And what this telescope is showing, and this is going to be the subject of chapter 3 and 4 and so on, the evidence, the anomalies, the cracks through materialism, may make us first entertain and then like endorse another viewpoint.
And how you rotate that telescope will show you different planets and galaxies.
Yes. It's like, no, don't point this way. Don't point this way. Keep it that way. Yeah. Well, so that's what's going on in chapter 2, when you tell us the different views of these Nobel laureates as to the problem of consciousness, one may say. And what's apparent there is this mantra, right? Like everything is ultimately physical. And so in chapter 3, you go and deconstruct or explain materialism. So can you do that for us in a perhaps more abridged version? But you speak about materialism, and then it's relabeled as physicalism, and there are kinds of it. But basically, the idea is the insistence that everything is ultimately physical, whatever physical means, or whatever everything we find.
Yeah, sure. Let's just start with that wonderful quote from Peter Leggett, who is one of the founding members of the Scientific Medical Network, a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, aeronautical scientist and Vice Chancellor of Surrey. And in his wonderful lectures, he said, by analogy with the pianist and the piano, the mind corresponds to the pianist and the brain to the piano. Now, if either pianist or piano be deficient, so will be the music. If either mind or brain be inadequate, so will be the person. So the distinction that has to be made is one between the active principle and its medium of expression. Here, the active principle is the pianist, the mind. The medium expression is the piano, the material. Now, coming back to your question about physicalism and materialism, physicalism is just another way of talking about materialism, where it was, I think, Otto Neurath, the Vienna Circle of logical positivism, he thought that materialism is too broad a term because we now have the experiments from quantum physics and relativity and all that show that there is a physical component to what we call matter, and matter is too loose a term. But without all that sort of hair splitting, the whole central dogma or the mantra of physicalism is that every physical cause has a physical effect. So that's known as causal closure. And the three versions of causal closure, there's weak, strong, and extreme. So, without splitting hairs any further, the weak version says any physical effect can have a sufficient physical cause. The strong one says only physical effects have a physical cause. And the extreme one says that there is no interaction between the physical realm and anything you might like to call the non-physical realm. So associated with that, there is reductive physicalism and there is non-reductive physicalism. Reductive meaning you can reduce everything to its components, and the reductive physicalism is deeply coupled with the soft problem of consciousness, that you can ultimately reduce all your problems to the ultimate physical problem of consciousness and find out brain structures and neural correlates and all of that to find a physical basis for consciousness. The non-reductive says that you can't reduce these top-level causes to the bottom, even though the bottom-level causes determine what happens at the top level. So non-reductive is not saying that there is a non-physical basis, but you can't just reduce things down to just the physical level. So there are versions of non-reductive and there are versions of reductive physicalism.
Yes, I like to think of those as different species within a taxonomic group.
That's right.
Because once you accept or you embrace the ideology that physical nature is all that exists, and what you're doing effectively is denying the existence of anything you will call non-physical, and then you start putting adjectives on it and call it supernatural and so on.
Yes, and try to explain it away.
Without questioning, again, that it's more than 100 years that the notions that were considered as physical as you can get, like space, but now space is curved, right? Time can shrink. Energy can be transformed into matter. And so all these notions of what is physical have been transcended in a way 100 years ago, but nevertheless, they commit to this idea of physicalism. And then these species, as you're pointing out, can express themselves in various degrees, like we wish different races of dogs, bigger and smaller, more ferocious and more kind. But at the end of the day, they all, for instance, the reductive aspects, as you point out in the chapter, need to engage in promissory materialism. or revisionary materialism, meaning, well, we just kick the ball to the future and say, yes, the problem is hard.
Down the road.
Yes, but we'll solve it. Or the revisionary version of it, which is a part of the strategy of the promissory materialism, is, well, whatever we find in the future, even if it just changes substantially our understanding of the mind or of the brain or of physics, we'll call it physical anyways. So we'll just change the goalpost. So in a way, all these efforts, Eddie, we are doing to refute or just leave room for other views that are not this physicalism, sometimes to me it seems absurd, because the proposition is either empty or refutes itself. But nevertheless, we need to spend so much energy just pointing it out.
There is an enormous amount of energy spent. I think Karl Hempel, the German scientist, many years ago, he said that if you're saying that everything is physical and it can be sorted out by physical means, well, that's fine. But if you're now saying that problems we can't sort out now will be sorted out by further physical discoveries, then you're really not saying anything. To which you can counteract by saying that physical things we didn't discover now have been partly discovered and resolved by further discoveries in the physical sciences, but they've only been resolved in the context in which they apply, nothing more. And promissory materialism is a very, very important and significant phrase used by Sir Karl Popper in his book with Sir John Eccles. And he openly said that the whole program of classical science has shown that science has gone beyond materialism. So science has transcended materialism. And when it comes from Sir Karl Popper, and we were talking of how Christoph Koch and Wilder Penfield had the courage to move on, well, so did Sir Karl Popper, because he was originally part of the Vienna Circle, which was totally materialistic.
Yes.
So the relationship with Sir John Eccles was a very fruitful one. Sir John Eccles got the Nobel Prize in medicine, and Sir John Eccles' mentor was Sir Charles Sherrington, whose last words were, "And now I only think that what the reality is the soul." And Sir Charles Sherrington was one of the leading lights in understanding the brain and spinal cord relationship. So promissory materialism is always dragged out. We don't know it now. We will in the future.
And again, here's another confusion, because if you speak about technology, sure, you can most certainly promise that in the future we'll fly faster or we'll drive cheaper. This sort of advancement, yes, this is happening technologically. But promissory materialism is betting on something that's a metaphysics plus on a problem, because you could say, well, we didn't know what heat was. We thought there was such a thing as the caloric, and then we figured out you can always tell the history of science out, well, there seemed to be something hard and we solved it. And yet there are many problems that remain unsolved. And you don't need to go all the way to consciousness, like in developmental biology, as you point out also, or inheritance of acquired characteristics. But when it comes to consciousness is not just like cracking water and realizing it's made of H2O. Even then, the notion of emergence doesn't quite make it, right? But consciousness is precisely the thing that Galileo just set aside from the purview of science for science to have the success it has had over the last 400 years. So consciousness is the very observation, the very experience of things. It's like now the scientist is studying its own capacity for experience and declaring it, again, epiphenomenal, supervenient, emergent. So here we arrive again at the paradox, right? At the paradox of us kind of looking through the microscope, if you wish, to try to discover our own experience and declaring it even an illusion, right? Some celebrated philosophers declare it as
an illusion,
non-existent in a way. It's preposterous. I mean, I'm surprised again. It's preposterous, but it's what dominates the thinking in neuroscience for sure.
It dominates the thinking, absolutely, Àlex, in a lot of neuroscience. And the problem they try and push away is so beautifully quoted by Terence McKenna. And Rupert Sheldrake mentions that in his book on morphic resonance. Terence McKenna saying the deterministic mantra is, give me one free miracle and I'll tell you everything else. And the one free miracle is how the laws of nature, the physical constants, the finely tuned physical constants, and all that came into being from seeming nothingness. And when you tell me that, I will deterministically tell you how everything unfolds. Whereas the converse to that is teleological, and teleology is something scientists hate, which means goal-orientated evolution, that a species, organisms, are moving towards their intended goal. And this is something in biological science, Rupert Sheldrake, Conrad Waddington, Sir Wentworth Darcy, and others have pointed towards that genes, however much you understand their chemical nature and how they're put together, genes don't explain the form and the structure and the function of an organism. We need developmental biology. So there are canalized pathways, as Waddington would say, whereby organisms move towards their intended goal, not just deterministically because of prior conditions. Determinism is also important, but it's not the sole ingredient.
Yes, and the rest of chapter 3 and a great deal of chapter 4, in them you articulate ways out within, still considering what you're writing about natural science. So these are not theological ways out, right? These are very concrete, both theoretical and also experimental or empirical, better said, ways out, or cracks or anomalies. I like to call them edges. I like to call them the edges of consciousness, because they're both marginalized but also cutting edge frontier.
I'll make a note of that. Edges. Nice. Yes, the edges of consciousness. I like that.
So you mentioned a few here. Perhaps we could go at least mention them, and then we may want to say something about it. But perhaps before that, before getting into paranormal phenomena, which is another way of talking about them, and we can do it comfortably, but this would scare or freak some people out, right? Because this is infuriating, as you write. There's nothing more infuriating for this kind of scientists to suggest the mind can act over matter. Nevertheless, they have no problem realizing they can lift their arm, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But before we go into this paranormal phenomena, and the list is long, and let's dwell a bit more on the problem of morphogenesis, because that's a clear problem for life. It's not even for philosophy of mind or consciousness study. It's a problem of life, the problem of morphogenesis, and the problem of memories. I mean, you don't need to go to these paranormal phenomena to find cracks in the materialism and materialist paradigm.
So morphogenesis is now associated with Rupert Sheldrake, and absolutely rightly so. But I mean, the idea goes back a long, long way, of course. Morphogenesis life fields, let's put it that way. And the precursor to that was vitalism, proposed by Hans Driesch, where he proposed this dualism between the physical organism and that which actuates and animates it. But the problem with the vitalist theory is this irresolvable dualism, between the two aspects of it. So the beauty of the morphogenic and morphic resonance, morphic fields are in space, morphic resonance is in time. They are non-local, that's very important. Unlike the electrical field or the field around a bar magnet, which is local, the morphogenic field is non-local, so it connects all things in space and time. The other point is the morphogenetic field is not energetic. It is the basis of formative causation. It's the basis of form and structure, but it's not energetic. And Sheldrake uses the analogy of building a house where the architect's plan has no energy in it, so to speak, but as a result of the plan, we have the energy of the builders and the weight of the bricks that results in the house.
Mm.
So morphogenetic fields act in conjunction with energetic fields. Going back a bit, in the perennial philosophy, there has always been the idea of the group mind or the group soul, where the experiences of a certain animal species will inform the whole of the animal species. So group soul is a precursor to the scientific exposition of morphogenesis.
Mm. Here, my academic training reminds me of the red flags of some words we are saying now with ease, like vitalism, right? Because it's utterly forbidden. And again, great
forbidden.
And great Nobel laureates, I remember, started some pieces always mocking vitalism. As I said jokingly too, vitalism is kind of a word that refutes himself because you only need to pronounce it for it to be considered nonsense. But sure, through vitalism we can at least realize that there's something missing. Maybe through another ism, organicism, this organic view.
Is another word,
Yes. We can address theoretically, what again, I want to emphasize is we can address theoretically through these theories or these concepts of morphic resonance and fields and so on, theoretically, what's still an empirical whole, right? Like we don't know. I mean, let me insist. Sure, the origin of energy and mass, we don't know. The origin of consciousness, if there was even ever an origin, we don't know. But when we go to the problem of life, we don't know whence form. And I like to realize that form and the problem of information, now so popular,
yes.
But even form, it's not just like the processing or whatever we might call experience. Where are forms coming from? And they're not coming from the genes. And some experiments by Michael Levin, for instance, show that you can just cut a planarian, this tiny creature, cut its brain, and its form, the instructions, that's how we like to think of it, how it will form its new head, and even the memories that it may have acquired weren't there in the genes. So the molecular view fails. Now, what is it? Is it electromagnetic fields? Is that enough? It's an empirical problem as well, and it's not solved. We don't know where form comes from.
I think the revolt against all of these ideas, if one can just summarize, the one central thing that they are revolting against is that it presupposes a non-mechanistic creative principle, which is still unknown to science.
Yes.
And there's this pride in science that if there isn't a theory, the experiment should not be allowed to exist, or the evidence should not be allowed to exist. Whereas the whole ethos of science is experiment, observation, and then theory. If you don't have a theory, it doesn't mean your experience is to be discounted. As Arthur Ellison's famous flower pot experiment showed, that you see what you want to see, you believe what you want to believe.
No, I agree. Anything that has a whiff of something non-mechanical, it's viciously attacked instantly.
Yes.
There was this Cartesian split, and there was like, okay, we'll create this boundary. You'll get to study this part, the mechanical part, the soul and everything else, okay, for some other people. But now this edge has been pushed, and so everything that something has some smell of soul, purpose, vitality,
goal-orientated evolution.
Yes, sure. Non-mechanical provokes this allergic reaction.
Despite the pronouncements of the greatest of scientists like Sir Karl Popper, Sir John Eccles, Einstein, Schrödinger, and that's the sad thing, that science does not listen to its brightest and most intelligent sons.
And the point you made about believing and seeing, right? We're told, well, seeing is believing, but if you don't believe, you don't see it. This is another playing with words, serious playing with words. And that's not just a happy phrase we say here. You can express it through Bayesian reasoning, how you update your priors, your probabilities, your beliefs about the world, how you update them based on new evidence, but you multiply them by your previous prior. And if your previous prior makes that new evidence impossible, means its probability of actually existing is zero, no matter what you bring in terms of evidence, you're not going to update your belief, not to say a change of paradigm. And so it's very true. There's this joke of, well, here's the evidence. And then the theoretician says, well, very nice, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? While Einstein and others told us that theories are not just constructions after the data is gathered, they are also what allows us to go and look for the data in the first place. So without theories, and it comes from theoria, like without theories, we're blind. We're blind to the data, literally. So there's the theoretical aspect, and then there's the empirical aspect again. So should we go now through the list of...
Absolutely, yeah, sure.
Yes. I don't know which one to pick. And again, my academic training make me reluctant because they all sound so pseudoscientific, and they're not.
Well, pick on out-of-body experiences.
All right, let's go for that.
Well, I mean, which is now becoming, it's really proliferating. I mean, the number of stories we hear. And when we hear it coming from academics and coming from professional people, you can't say some silly... New Age person or someone who is deluding. I mean, Robert Monroe, for example, the American businessman and an engineer, he talked about the three locales. And what we see, Alex, is a consistency in their descriptions. The details obviously vary, but there is a consistency. They always talk of three localities, so to speak, or spaces of consciousness. I mean, the first one is, of course, the here and now space we inhabit, three-dimensional space and time. But the second one is apparently a much larger one, which is the space of the traditional, I say traditional, heavens and hells, and is a region that people inhabit after death, soon after death. And the third locality is the space people are living in a very different world from the world we're living in now. So that is not so different from Sir Auckland Geddes, who, when he was extremely ill, from gastroenteritis, I believe, and he had out-of-body experience. He first experienced the immediate here and now. Then he was able to see his house and immediate locality, and then he had a more holistic vision. So one sees these three aspects of out-of-body experiences that seem to be very consistent in their overall descriptions, even though the details vary, of course.
It's intriguing to me here, and I think we'll cover it because there are many more chapters to come and volumes to come.
Yeah, sure.
The notion of a body, right? Because you say, well, the astral body, and 10 years ago, 5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I would have said, whatever, the astral. I mean, that's what I see on TV at 2 a.m. if you want to phone some, right?
Yeah.
But it's worth considering what's meant by a body and by other worlds, right?
Yeah.
And these other bodies, because when you have an out-of-body experience or when you have a lucid dream, you also have a body, and what are the properties of this body, and what's the relationship with what do we consider a body even here and now? These are not minute questions.
Yeah, let's think of the wave and the particle, or energy and matter. They're not separate things. The wave expresses as a particle, not in a particle. Energy doesn't express in matter. Energy presents as matter. So a field is regarded as the bounding influence of a force that radiates outwards, and the boundaries of that field regarded in the particle aspect is the body. The body is the boundaries of that field of force.
Yes.
And people who've had the out-of-body experience can literally look down on themselves and see themselves sometimes as a luminous shape or whatever, but definitely as a definite shape.
Yes. And so the mainstream neuroscientists would and should say, well, this is some sort of wrong operation in your brain, some hallucination, something's going wrong in your head. But then when you speak about out-of-body experiences within a near-death experience that are veridical, where the person coming back can attest some, we can call it objective physical facts that then are go unchecked, and there's some reports about it, then, well, that doesn't immediately refute the entire paradigm, but these are anomalies that must be considered. And usually what's said is, well, if I cannot say there's a flaw in the argument or in the experiment, it must be fraud. But that's totally unfair, because there are accounts of these for NDEs, for OBs, lucid dreaming. Then we have other effects or other protocols and phenomena like remote viewing. Again, the capacity to sense information in anomalous ways. And here, anomalous means what the word anomalous means, which is we have a frame, and anything, I use this metaphor, anyone or anything that looks kind of moving, blurred in the picture with that frame, we'll just try to pretend it's not there. So that's what they call anomalous. But under another frame of reference, maybe these are just very normal, which I think is precisely the case for perennial philosophy. But here we have remote viewing as another of these. And there's huge literature, and people don't know. When I mention it to academics or even journalists, I get this pushback, kind of this very predictable set of pushback reactions. And one of them is, well, there's no scientific work done on that. And I can only laugh or just say, well, there are hundreds of articles in peer-reviewed papers. I mean, what do you mean? Well, it must be wrong. It must be flawed.
Veridical is a very important word, because if, when you're supposedly unconscious on the operating table and the clock behind you, so even if you could see when you're unconscious, which is ridiculous, if the clock behind you says the surgeon divided your left and right brain in half at 10:30 a.m. And in your out-of-body experience, you mentioned 10:30 a.m., there is no way you can say you were deluding or you were in a state of illusion. You were unconscious. Out-of-body, you had a veridical experience in actual space and time. Remote viewing is a very good case in point and example. There is the recorded or the, I think, authenticated example of Ingo Swann, who remote viewed the surface of Mars, which was then verified by the satellites. But people could always say data error and manipulating the facts and all the rest of it. The best example of remote viewing comes from none other than Jessica Utz, who was or is a professor of statistics at California University, president of the American Statistical Association, and in her presidential address to the Statistical Associations, if I can call it that way, with over 6,000 members, she presented robust evidence on remote viewing. And she said that, I asked the audience, what original research have they read? And they mostly admit they've read nothing. And they hadn't read anything significant. So that is a very good definition of pseudoscience. They will only knock what they believe to be the case.
Yes.
She also goes on to say that remote viewing is not abnormal. It is perfectly normal. And if the statistical evidence were applied to mundane areas of science, it would be taken on board without questioning.
Yes.
But because that evidence applies to so-called anomalous phenomena, it is questioned and jettisoned.
Yes.
So this comes from a top statistician.
Yes.
Talking of the strong evidence for remote viewing, there is another strong evidence, from one of the American remote viewers employed by the CIA, who remote viewed a Russian nuclear submarine. And he saw a ramp from wherever the submarine was being constructed, a ramp into the sea. And satellite pictures months later showed the construction of the ramp. So he was remote viewing in time. So with remote viewing, you can fast forward in time and switch back in time.
Yes. Now, some of these accounts or these experiments or this data, as you're saying, they comply, they use the double-blind procedure, meta-analyses are done of them, they're replicated. The controls and the statistics are as good, sometimes even better, than in other areas in psychology, neurobiology, we could even dare chemistry or physics. Now, they're not believed because they're impossible.
Yeah.
And so here we can come back to some of these items in the list, because they're not just items in the list. Actually, they in a way they reflect these latent powers we were discussing on a previous conversation.
Yes,
and later on, I can advance the reader or the listener that you will place those psychic abilities, and not at the top. You'll say, well, then there's spiritual powers, and these psychic abilities, well, they're not so important if one just gets captured by them. This is also problematic within this spiritual development of
very
men.
important not to be glamorized by psychic powers. They're only stepping stones.
Because this is another danger. Once you start to acknowledge they're possible, then it's like, okay, I want to have them. But it's not about that either. But I was bringing all this to say that we should deconstruct the famous mantra: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yes. That's Carl Sagan's. That is often thrown out when someone says something that is regarded as anomalous. And we can think of many things that were regarded as very extraordinary. What about 50 kilograms, or there's a mistake in the book, it's not 1 kilogram, 50 kilograms of uranium-235, destroying 90% of Hiroshima. Now, the table I'm sitting on weighs more than 50 kilograms, but how about destroying 90% of a city? I mean, how ridiculous was that at one time?
Yes.
What about, I think the best example is airplane flying. Yeah. 8 years before the Wright brothers in 1903 took off at Kitty Hawk, wasn't it? The sand place in North Carolina. 8 years before that, Lord Kelvin, the president of the Royal Society, said heavier than air flight is impossible. Well, it wasn't. What about Mars, once declared to be completely dry and arid, is now harboring water? What about Venus, once declared to be completely inhospitable? They found phosphine, which is an organic molecule. All of this was pretty extraordinary claims. But now the march of science, great science, has shown that we have extraordinary evidence to corroborate extraordinary claims.
Yes. There's other ways of ending the sentence. Extraordinary claims, as Abilov says, require extraordinary funding. I like that.
Extraordinary funding, that's a good way.
I've heard another one that's extraordinary claims require extraordinary patience.
Yes.
Because these experiments are, as any experiment, but these ones in particular, are not easy to do. And even if you've done them, and even if you get positive results, and you try to publish them, they won't be accepted. They won't even be entertained most of the time. And so they require a lot of patience. And if I may bring something from your book, perhaps a lot of extraordinary sincerity and purity, because this is confusing, emotionally charged, and it's so easy to go from a position of dogmatic skeptic to just dogmatic believer. And that's also something I wanted to ask you. It's not in these chapters, but as you know, I'm engaged in this research, and I oscillate between doubt and belief. And this is very taxing on the scientists studying this.
That's a wonderful word you use, purity and sincerity. I was going to say extraordinary objectivity and impartiality, but you put it even better, even far better than I could have done. It really does need deeply questioning your own beliefs, your own conditioning, your own wanting to see the result you want to see, the file drawer effect, so to speak, where you only publish what supports your position, confirmation bias, where the researcher unconsciously moves towards the result he wants to find. And this is where statistical meta-analysis plays a very large part.
Yeah, and I would say that studying consciousness, this is perhaps an invitation, because we need more young minds to study consciousness. Studying consciousness and studying the edges of consciousness, it's punished by the status quo, but at the same time, I feel it's a clear example of a scientist not just applying his or her intellect, but the whole being. I mean, this is tough, and at the same time, it sounds like part of the mystery teachings, because you're engaging your whole humanity. You go and do the experiment, you think about those things, and you wonder, well, why am I not having these powers? Or why am I deluded when I see it in other people? Or so this shapes your whole being. I mean, I'm talking from first-person experience.
Absolutely so, Àlex. And the great scientists have talked about the feeling of love, literally, that they have experienced in studying deeply what they were engaged in, and participation.
Yes, participation is a key word.
Participation, as John Wheeler said. And I think Barbara McClintock, she got the Nobel Prize, didn't she? And for, I forget what, but something in molecular biology. And she really felt she was part of what she was studying and researching. So unless there is a change of being, the research is partial. It's like a marriage. Let's put it that way. In a marriage, there is a change of being, isn't there? In that harmony.
Yes.
An artist or pianist or violinist, he's not obviously playing mechanically. He is changing as a result of his performance.
Yes. So here's an invitation, because you mentioned objectivity. So this kind of extreme objectivity married with an opposite which is this intimate participation. That's how I feel when I engage in this. And it sounds impossible, but I think it's probably a coincidence of opposites of what the future scientist may look like. Somebody who's pretending, in the good sense, trying to be as objective as possible, and yet being dissolved in the very experiment that's taking place.
Yes, it is a paradox, but objectivity here is, if we understand it as being completely inwardly transparent, so there's no conditioning. One is transparent. There is no coloring.
Yes. Now, I think we could end here, but I'd like to briefly come back and mention other of these phenomena that
certainly
create big holes through which we can see new rooms in the house of science, and perhaps of the human being, that materialist walls want to prevent us from even discussing, right? Because there's, you already alluded to it, causality from the future. When you're remote viewing, you're not only doing it non-locally in space, you may be doing it in time. And you can go back to some interpretations of quantum mechanics, and retrocausality is an option. So again, I like to go back between empirical data and theory. Theoretically, it is conceivable. It is not easy, but it is conceivable. And empirically, there's some evidence. So something so preposterous again as, well, you're seeing something that hasn't happened yet. Well, here you go. Just deal with it.
It hasn't happened. It hasn't been projected into our world of materiality. It has happened, or the noumenal, the causative influences are there.
Let me mention a couple more of heretic ideas.
Syntropy and synchronicity are exactly what I think you're alluding to.
Yes.
That the entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, is really a measure of the dissipative processes in a closed system, and the entropic arrow goes only in one direction. Syntropy is a reversal of that, and it's a coming together and complexity of systems towards their wholeness and unity.
Yes.
So both are necessary. And with syntropy, there are attractors from the future, so to speak, that move it in the direction of its intended outcome.
Yes, and these are concepts, beautiful concepts that we could unpack. We don't have time, but indeed, like synchronicity, the coincidence of an objective side and a subjective side, with meaning being the glue that brings it together and makes it stand out.
Meaning and sincerity.
Yes. Often dismissed as just coincidence. There are many C's here, right? Correlation, coincidence, causality. Well, this is another topic. I wanted to mention too, distant healing. Totally anathema, right? Like if you mention, because you can mention those things now, if you bring in the healing dimension, it's rarely, it's infuriating again, it's rarely tolerated. But the evidence, again, that these things not only can happen, but probably do happen.
I think Peter Fenwick, the emeritus president of the Scientific Medical Network, has presented evidence, clinical evidence, about the efficacy of prayer. Well, prayer associated, of course, with distant healing doesn't have to be only through prayer. But the world history is full of examples of so-called miraculous healing by the thoughts of healers, but also the receptive nature of the patient wanting to be healed. If you question it, obviously the healing power has got a job to do. But distant healing again shows or alludes to extended mind.
Yeah. And the word placebo here is often thrown in the mix, but placebo is a word that explains much less than than it says just by uttering it, right? We don't know yet how that thing called placebo works, but at least it's accepted that it exists. In fact, pharmaceutical companies need that as a control for their supposed efficacy. So it's accepted, but it's still rather mysterious how it happens. I'm saying this because some people will say, well, this distant healing, whatever, or this praying, whatever, it's some sort of placebo. But then you would ask, well, what's placebo then? In the same way that they would say it's nothing but matter. And then you would ask, well, what's matter then? And that would be the end of the conversation, probably.
Placebo is a convenient way of explaining away. It doesn't explain at all. It explains away something that's uncomfortable.
And two more items in this list, which are perhaps the more serious and the ones that would cause more reaction against, which have to do with survival, right? Because some of these items we've discussed, phenomena, have to do with psychic powers, mind over matter, mind over mind. Okay, fine. This is difficult, but now when we start talking about mediumship or reincarnation, so everything that happens when we die, again, back to chapter 2, if the brain and the mind are exactly the same thing, when the brain dies, the mind dies. Finito. It's the end. But all these teachings have been saying forever that that's not what it looks to be. What it looks to be.
No, not at all. It reverses it, in fact. And again, I keep coming back to great scientists pointing to the non-material principle. One we haven't talked about was Gustav Stromberg, who was on the staff of Mount Wilson Observatory in America. And Stromberg saying, I'm convinced that our consciousness is rooted in a world not built of atoms and molecules. That's going back a little bit, but Stromberg's the book, The World Soul, was very warmly commented on by Einstein, which is why I'm mentioning it. So the most convincing evidence comes from Ian Stevenson, who wrote several volumes on children's claimed memories of past lives. And as a great scientist, he said claimed memories. He didn't say proven memories. The evidence is mounting. It is so strong. And the problem with reincarnation and after death is this whole question of memory. If memory is located in the brain, then memory dies with the brain, but it's not located in the brain. The brain acts as a sort of transducer, rather like your television receiver acts as a transducer. The images, the person is not in the television, it's transducing the signals. So this whole subject of afterlife is clarified when one sees that the physical body is the projection of a higher principle. We are material beings, but our animating principle is immortal.
And again, the distinction between the productive function and the transmissive or permissive function,
William James,
helps frame all these anomalies now have a place. At least they have a place. So let me insist, we have the empirical evidence, and now we have a frame to put them, and they don't need to be brushed away, squeezed, explained away. And I can see, I suppose, I know because I've read the rest of your chapters, that the mystery teachings are even a deeper ground upon which this permissive, transmissive brain hypothesis or understanding of the function is grounded, on top of which these phenomena are grounded. And this is the whole iceberg that we don't see in mainstream science. And as I see these chapters we discussed today, 2, 3, and 4, are just bringing it to us so that we can contemplate that iceberg and realize, again, that there are some limits in our understanding. And now what do we do with those limits? We pretend to forget them, or we try to transcend them?
We transcend them. We don't throw them away. We use them as building blocks and stepping stones. And just quickly on reincarnation, there's some excellent work being done by Professor Richard Silberstein in Australia. He founded the Swinburne Institute of Neuroscience, and he's showing how bioelectric fields interact with biology. And this seems to explain, I say seems to, one of Ian Stevenson's concerns all the time. Why do people have birthmarks? Was it an injury in a former life, or what was it? And this is what Richard Silberstein is researching, how bioelectric fields interact with biology.
Yes, yes.
Using cutting-edge science to move forward.
We won't get into the sociological and political and economic problems that are related to the possibility of studying those. But let me just say, well, those who know it already, that's great. But those scientists, maybe young scientists who might, by chance may read or listen what we're saying here, there's a lot of people whom for many decades have been doing a lot of serious, rigorous research on this. And the moment you scratch, you find one. This happened to me, you find one, you think you're alone, you find two, and there are hundreds of them. They're just on the ground, maybe like mycelial networks. They're not like the big trees that we see on television, but they're there, and it can be done, and it's a proper field of study. So I would just leave it at that.
And as Darwin's great co-worker, Alfred Wallace, said, the whole history of science shows that whenever even the most highly educated and scientific men of any age have denied the fact of investigation and denied it on a priori grounds from cause effect, they're inevitably being proven to be wrong. So whatever the authority of the scientist, it doesn't mean anything when the evidence is before you that denies his assumptions.
Yes, and I would add to just make it less grandiose in terms of the unfolding of human potentials, just from a curious standpoint. This is fascinating stuff. This is the unknown. This is, in a way, fun, I could say, but also what being a scientist is meant to be. Somebody who's curious and wants to poke and wants to follow the evidence and the hypotheses where they lead them, not somebody who's just trying to please those who are deciding the selection process as to which you can move to the next point in your career. Because let me tell you, then it's too late. I mean, you say, well, I'll do it when I finish my PhD. Well, then you cannot, because you need to continue and publish as a postdoc, and then you need to start your lab, and then when I have tenure, but then you don't because you still need to get grants, and then when I retired, when I win the Nobel Prize. And some of these reflections that we read are often written, in my view, too late, because we need a community that studies those things in a relaxed way, not feeling we're kind of doing it in the dark or subverting the paradigm.
In a factory, as Ian Begilchis put it so well, science is now practice factory fashion. And any scientist who steps out of line will find his career on the rocks. And even a famous scientist has a lot to lose. And as Einstein said in his talk to the Jewish seminary, this fatal blindness, as he puts it, gets transmitted from generation to generation and involves a whole new generation.
Yes. Well, we could leave it here. Maybe a final words about where we are today after discussing chapters 2, 3, and 4 and what's going to come. Would you like to say something about that?
After chapter 4, chapter 5 and 6 is really opening the door to the mystery teachings. And here I'd like really to talk about the wonderful work of William James, what I call the new way of knowing. And he talks about the conventional view of the brain as productive function, but then there's also permissive, releasing, and also transmissive. So the brain is a filter. And then, as every great scientist should do, he should be in touch with great literature and great poets. And William James quotes the wonderful poet Shelley when he uses the analogy of the brain as a filter. He quotes Shelley, and Shelley says, "Life, like a dome of many-colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity." So our brains are like colored glass, not grass, like colored glass. So we have a refractive index, so to speak. And the more we bend the light that comes through and break it up into various colors, we lose sight of the white light of truth that is behind us and around us.
That's wonderful, and a wonderful way to stop and invite everyone to stay with us in this journey. Thank you, Edi.
Thank you, Àlex. Wonderful being with you, as always.
Thank you.